Hey there. Tonight's story begins after the war ends, after the heroes sail home, after the city falls, and after the glory fades. Because for the victors of Troy, peace was never promised. What followed was betrayal, heartbreak, monsters, storms, and curses that would echo for generations. This is the quiet unravelling of legendary men, told slowly and softly, as they return to homes that barely remember them, or not at all. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is right now. It's always strangely comforting to see who else is out there drifting off to the same quiet myth. So, close your eyes. Let the warships fade into the distance, and come with me to the part of the story most never tell. So, the war was over. Troy had burned, its once proud towers now reduced to crumbled stone and smouldering ash. The Greeks had done what they came for, though it had taken 10 years, a wooden horse, and no small amount of divine interference. They stood victorious, weary and weathered, clutching the spoils of war and preparing for home. But of course, no one ever said getting home would be simple. One might assume that after 10 years abroad, a warrior could simply board his ship and sail back to the comforts of hearth and wife. That was rarely the case. This was ancient Greece after all, a place where the gods were fickle, the seas treacherous, and even the stars occasionally refused to cooperate. The journey home, or nostos as the Greeks called it, would prove just as storied and sorrowful as the war itself. Let us begin with the most infamous of these journeys, that of Odysseus. King of Ithaca, famed for his cunning, inventor of the Trojan horse, or at least the best PR for it, and very much unprepared for how long a simple boat ride could take when Poseidon was in a foul mood. You see, Odysseus made a rather unfortunate decision upon departing Troy. He didn't thank the gods properly. A small omission, but one that would stretch a short voyage into a 10-year odyssey. Poseidon, god of the sea, was particularly offended. It didn't help that Odysseus had blinded his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, along the way. In fairness, Polyphemus had eaten several of his crew and didn't respond well to reasoned discussion. Still, the sea god was not the forgiving type. So Odysseus was tossed from island to island, seduced by nymphs, shipwrecked repeatedly, and even made to visit the land of the dead, just in case things weren't miserable enough already. But Odysseus was not alone in his troubles. The Greeks had split into various homeward-bound contingents, each facing their own ill luck. Menelaus, husband of Helen, the woman allegedly responsible for all this carnage, took a rather indirect route home. He wandered as far as Egypt, which, even by heroic standards, is rather off course. There he wrestled with the shape-shifting sea god Proteus, as one does, in order to gain the knowledge of how to appease the gods and calm the winds. This required holding Proteus tightly while he transformed into a lion, a snake, a tree, and a stream of water, before finally surrendering his secrets. There were no shortcuts in Bronze Age travel. Historical records, well, as much as we can call them that, do suggest that Greek sailors at the time weren't especially equipped for reliable maritime navigation. They hugged coastlines, avoided night travel, and interpreted weather patterns through a mixture of guesswork and prayer. Their ships were sturdy enough for the Aegean, but the open Mediterranean posed significant challenges. Add to this the divine meddling, and one can see why so many of these heroes took the scenic route home. Diomedes, one of the mightiest warriors of the war, fared little better. He returned to Argos only to find that his wife had taken a lover during his absence and was plotting to kill him. To her credit, 10 years is a long time. Rather than make a fuss, Diomedes fled to Italy, where he eventually faded into the vague mists of local legend, worshipped in some places as a minor deity. A rather anticlimactic ending for a man who once wounded both Ares and Aphrodite in battle. Nestor, the oldest and perhaps wisest of the Greek commanders, seems to have made it home without too much divine harassment. It helps, one suspects, that he kept his head down, said his prayers, and refrained from boasting about clever ideas involving wooden horses. There's a lesson in that. Agamemnon, leader of the Greek coalition and brother to Menelaus, did reach home, only to be murdered in his bath by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. But more on that particular bit of family dysfunction in the next chapter. Suffice it to say, the post-war glow did not last long for the house of Atreus. There was a curious sense in the Greek imagination that war never truly ended. Victory was merely the prelude to a different kind of suffering. The gods did not reward triumph with peace. In fact, they often punished it. Hubris, that quintessentially Greek concept of arrogant pride, was a capital offence in the eyes of Olympus. If a man returned home boasting of his glory, he was inviting divine correction. And then there were the storms. Natural, of course, but also supernatural. The seas between Troy and Greece were notoriously rough. The Hellespont, the Aegean, and beyond, all capricious, especially to ships lacking proper ballast or understanding of wind currents. The Greeks often personified these elements as gods or spirits, harpies, sea nymphs, angry winds. Because when your fleet is scattered overnight and half your crew vanishes, blaming an angry goddess feels more comforting than admitting you misread a cloud. The return home also meant confronting time itself. 10 years of war meant a decade lost. Children grew up without fathers, political alliances shifted, and thrones were not always waiting patiently for their former occupants. The journey was not just geographical, it was existential. These men returned not as heroes, but as strangers. This theme runs deeply through Homer's Odyssey. Odysseus longs for home, for Ithaca, for Penelope, and Telemachus. Yet at every turn, he's offered comfort, even immortality, by figures like Calypso. Still, he chooses hardship. The Greek mind revered the idea of nostos, but it also understood that one could never truly go home unchanged. The home you remembered was gone, and so were you. Meanwhile, the gods watched all this with their usual mix of boredom and caprice. Athena took a special interest in Odysseus, helping him occasionally when she remembered to, while Zeus played both sides as usual. Poseidon sulked, Hermes ferried souls to the underworld, and Apollo, who had spent much of the war firing plague arrows, returned to more musical pursuits. The war had ended, but peace was elusive. Even those who made it back without divine interference faced restless kingdoms and unruly citizens. Some were worshipped, others resented. The line between hero and troublemaker blurred easily. And what of the ships themselves? Ancient Greek ships, primarily pentaconters and biremes, were long, narrow and powered by both sails and oars. They weren't built for comfort. There were no cabins, no galleys, no protection from the elements. Sailors slept where they could, ate cold rations, and relied on wind and muscle. Navigation was by stars, sun, and intuition. That so many even attempted long voyages is a testament to their stubborn optimism. Or perhaps their lack of alternatives. Many of the ships were lost, scattered in storms or dashed against unfamiliar shores. The sea claimed them silently. No epic poems were written for those whose names did not survive, but their ghosts, one imagines, lingered along lonely beaches and under wine-dark waves. In the centuries that followed, Greek poets and playwrights would return again and again to these post-war stories. The nostoi, as they came to be called, were an entire genre. The war was a given, brutal but glorious. The return, though, was where the real drama lay. That's where men broke, or bent, or found meaning. We're used to thinking of myths as grand, flashy things. Monsters, magic, climactic battles. But the Greeks understood that the quiet aftermath was where tragedy bloomed. The war ended with a horse and fire, but the real stories began when the sails went up, and home became a dream somewhere on the horizon. Even in the archaeological record, there are hints of this turbulent return. Many Mycenaean palaces show signs of sudden destruction around the same period: burned walls, toppled columns, abandoned treasures. Was it invasion, rebellion, or simply the long echo of a war that refused to stay on foreign soil? Historians debate, as they always do, but the myth has its own answers. The gods were not finished yet, so the Greeks sailed home, slowly, painfully, circuitously. They were shipwrecked, seduced, cursed, and forgotten. Some never arrived. Others returned only to find they were no longer welcome, and a few, like Odysseus, clung to the memory of home like a compass, trusting that however long the journey, there was still something waiting at the end. Whether there was or not, well, that's another story. So, let us now drift back into the murky waters of post-war homecomings. If you were hoping that at least one Greek king had a cheerful reunion with his family after 10 years away, I'm afraid you've wandered into the wrong epic. This is the tale of Agamemnon, commander of the Greek forces at Troy, brother to Menelaus, and a man whose homecoming can be summed up in 2 words: unfortunately brief. Agamemnon had led the 1,000-ship fleet to Troy and played his part with ruthless efficiency. He sacrificed his own daughter to appease the winds, squabbled with Achilles over a slave girl, and generally made himself disagreeable to gods and men alike. He did, however, win the war, which you might think would count for something, but his victory came at a price, one that followed him all the way back to Mycenae, where his wife, Clytemnestra, was waiting. Now, the story of Clytemnestra is not a cheerful one, but she is often painted far too simply as a vindictive woman with a grudge. In truth, she had good reason to be angry. Years before, Agamemnon had sacrificed their daughter, Iphigenia, to ensure favourable winds for the Greek fleet. No warning, no consultation. Just a priest, an altar, and a quiet murder dressed up as a divine necessity. Clytemnestra, understandably, took it personally. While Agamemnon was away playing war hero, she had not exactly remained idle. She took a lover, Aegisthus, a man with his own reasons to loathe the house of Atreus, and together they plotted. It wasn't just revenge, it was justice, retribution, and perhaps a bit of long overdue housekeeping. And so, After years of war and an arduous return journey, Agamemnon finally sailed into the bay beneath his palace, the bronze towers of Mycenae gleaming in the distance. One can imagine him standing on the deck of his ship, sun-worn and grimy, dreaming of a warm bath and roasted lamb. Unfortunately, that bath would be the last comfort he ever knew. In Aeschylus's Agamemnon, the king arrives with Cassandra, the Trojan prophetess he had taken as a war prize. Now, bringing home a captive concubine might seem a rather bold decision when your wife is already displeased, but Agamemnon never was known for subtlety. Cassandra, cursed by Apollo to see the future, but never be believed, saw exactly what was coming. She walked into the palace like a woman entering a tomb, resigned, poetic, and ignored. The bath was drawn, the robes laid out, and there, amid the steam and ceremony of a long-awaited homecoming, Clytemnestra murdered her husband with an axe, or perhaps a sword. The details vary, as myths tend to do. In some versions, she entangles him in a net before the killing blow. In others, he's struck as he reclines, utterly unaware. But all agree on the outcome. Agamemnon, war hero and king, dead in his own house by his wife's hand. It wasn't just personal. It was political, symbolic, even ritualistic. The house of Atreus had long been a mire of curses, betrayals and bloodshed. Tantalus, Atreus, Thyestes. Each generation passed down a fresh scandal. Agamemnon's death was less a surprise than a grim inevitability. The Greeks, ever lovers of a tragic arc, saw this not merely as domestic drama, but divine rebalancing. You see, no crime went unpunished in the world of myth, especially not those committed against family. Agamemnon's sacrifice of Iphigenia had broken a sacred bond, and blood, as always, demanded more blood. Clytemnestra and Aegisthus ruled Mycenae together for several years after the murder. By some accounts, they were competent, even prosperous rulers. But the shadow of what they'd done lingered. And somewhere far away, growing older in exile, Agamemnon's son, Orestes, was watching, waiting, and nursing a very different idea of justice. Before we turn to him, it's worth pausing to consider the historical underpinnings of all this myth. Mycenae was indeed a real place, an imposing Bronze Age citadel with massive stone walls and a commanding view of the surrounding valley. The shaft graves of Mycenaean kings, discovered centuries later, revealed a world of wealth, weaponry, and ceremonial grandeur. One grave contained a golden death mask, once romantically dubbed the Mask of Agamemnon, though the identification is largely wishful thinking. Still, the myths do seem to echo something real, that returning warriors found their homes changed, their families distant, and their power unstable. In many Mycenaean centres, we find signs of abrupt destruction or abandonment around the same time period, evidence, perhaps, of internal unrest or social collapse. It's not hard to imagine that some kings returned home only to face suspicion, usurpation, or worse. Back in the myth, Agamemnon's fate was only the beginning of a longer tragedy. Clytemnestra may have seen herself as an avenger, but in the logic of Greek myth, she was also a murderer. And the gods, as always, had opinions. Enter Orestes. Raised in exile, likely by allies of his father or sympathetic family retainers, Orestes grew up with one goal: to avenge his father's death. But here the myth gets deliciously tangled. To kill one's mother, even a murderous one, was not a simple act of vengeance. It was a spiritual crime, one that brought its own consequences. When Orestes returned to Mycenae, he did what he believed was necessary. He killed Aegisthus first, which no one particularly objected to. Then he confronted Clytemnestra. In some retellings, she pleads with him, bares her breast, reminds him that she gave him life. But Orestes, trembling with fury and fate, strikes her down. The moment is terrible, quiet, almost ritualistic. And then the Furies come. The Greeks called them the Erinyes, ancient goddesses of vengeance who pursued those who spilled kindred blood. Black-robed, snake-haired, they drove Orestes into madness. He fled from temple to temple, seeking purification, but the Furies were relentless. Guilt in the ancient Greek mind was not a matter of conscience. It was an external force, almost a physical illness, stalking the sinner until justice was done. Eventually, Orestes found sanctuary in Athens, where the goddess Athena intervened. In a trial on the Areopagus, a rocky outcrop used for real-life criminal cases, she declared that the cycle of blood vengeance must end. Orestes was acquitted, and the Furies, soothed by the promise of new rights and honour, became the Eumenides, the kindly ones. It's a tidy mythological solution to the messy business of familial revenge. The story of Agamemnon and his family was endlessly retold in Greek tragedy. Aeschylus's Oresteia, Euripides' Electra, Sophocles' Electra. Each playwright offered their own shading. Was Clytemnestra a villain, or a mother driven to desperate justice? Was Orestes a hero, or a victim of divine contradiction? These were not tales with clear morals, but rather mirrors for the Greeks to reflect on law, loyalty, and the dangerous gravity of blood. From a cultural perspective, the myth encapsulated deep anxieties about power and homecoming. The idea that a king, triumphant abroad, might return only to fall in his own bath. It struck a chord. Greece was no stranger to political upheaval. City-states were rife with coups, assassinations, and shifting loyalties. The myth merely dressed these realities in poetic garb. And then there's Cassandra, the tragic footnote. Cursed by Apollo to prophesy truly but be ignored, she knew what would happen the moment they stepped ashore. In most versions, she was murdered alongside Agamemnon, either in the palace or just outside it. Her death, barely remarked upon in many accounts, adds a final note of melancholy to the tale. She had seen it all and still could not stop it. Cassandra's curse is one of those mythic touches that feels eerily modern. To know the truth and be disbelieved, there's something timeless about that. She becomes a symbol not just of doomed foresight, but of the loneliness that comes with clarity. The home of Agamemnon thus became a kind of mythological crime scene, revisited again and again by poets, playwrights, and priests. It was a cautionary tale, a tragic cycle, and a puzzle box of competing ethics. Was Agamemnon a villain for killing his daughter? Was Clytemnestra right to kill him? Was Orestes justified in avenging his father? Each answer led to another question. But for our purposes, here in the soft, slow hours of night, it is enough to say that Agamemnon came home and died. That a bath, which might have been warm and soothing, became a tomb. That behind palace walls, the real war continued, quieter but no less brutal. And that even kings, even the great and bronze-clad, were not spared the price of their choices. So the torch of vengeance passed from hand to hand, from Clytemnestra to Orestes, from gods to mortals and back again. And in the quiet corridors of Mycenae, the stones remembered it all. Tomorrow, perhaps, we'll visit Odysseus again. But for now, let us rest in the ruins of a palace where the echoes of footsteps, long silence, still murmur their ancient regrets. Let us now turn to a man who, more than any other, came to embody the very concept of Nostos, the homecoming. Odysseus, king of the modest island of Ithaca, veteran of the Trojan War, and possessor of a famously complicated relationship with the gods. His story, immortalized in Homer's Odyssey, is less a journey and more an endurance test, a 10-year sequence of delays, detours, distractions, and divine punishments. In truth, if he'd just taken the ferry and kept his head down, he might have been home in a week. But where would the poetry be in that? Odysseus had a reputation for cleverness. He devised the idea of the Trojan horse, after all, though how much of that was his idea and how much poetic license, we'll never know. Regardless, it was a decision that ensured the city's fall and secured his place in history, and Poseidon's grudge list. The trouble began shortly after he and his men set sail from Troy. The gods were, let's say, less than pleased. In some versions, Odysseus forgot to thank them. In others, he was simply caught up in the divine fallout of the war. Most notably, he had offended Poseidon by blinding the Cyclops Polyphemus. A necessary act of survival, yes, but when the giant turns out to be the sea god's son, well, you can expect choppy waters ahead. And so, the long voyage began. One might imagine that the journey from Troy to Ithaca, roughly 1,000 kilometres, wouldn't take a decade, even in a boat powered by oars and optimism. But then, Odysseus had a particular knack for getting lost in spectacular ways. The first stop was the land of the Cicones, where his men made the classic mistake of raiding a village, overstaying their welcome, and being driven off by the locals. Not exactly an auspicious start. Then came the Lotus Eaters, a rather dreamlike group who offered Odysseus's crew a plant that made them forget all desire to return home. A tempting proposition that, and one might argue, more peaceful than anything that came after. Still, Odysseus, annoyingly responsible, dragged them back to the ships and sailed on. Next was the infamous encounter with the Cyclops. Trapped in a cave with Polyphemus, Odysseus introduced himself, cleverly, as nobody, got the giant drunk on strong wine, and blinded him with a red-hot stake. When the Cyclops screamed for help, shouting that nobody is hurting me, his fellow giants presumably shrugged and went back to napping. It was ingenious, really. Unfortunately, before sailing off, Odysseus made the crucial mistake of shouting his real name back at Polyphemus. This allowed the injured Cyclops to pray to Poseidon for vengeance, and Poseidon, being a rather involved parent, obliged. Now firmly on the gods' naughty list, Odysseus continued his zigzagging path across the wine-dark sea. He stopped next at the island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. Aeolus was surprisingly helpful, bottling up all the adverse winds in a bag and giving Odysseus only the breeze he needed. All would have been well, if only Odysseus's crew hadn't been quite so curious. Thinking the bag contained treasure, they opened it just as Ithaca came into view. The winds escaped, a storm rose, and they were blown back to square one. One imagines Odysseus briefly contemplating life as a shepherd instead. Then came the Laestrygonians, giants with a talent for smashing ships and eating sailors. Most of Odysseus's fleet was destroyed here, leaving him with just one vessel. It's the sort of incident that tends to dampen morale, though one suspects Odysseus had already adjusted to lowered expectations. From there, it was on to the island of Circe, enchantress, sorceress, part-time pig farmer. She turned his men into swine, as one does, though whether that was punishment or commentary is unclear. Hermes, ever helpful, gave Odysseus a magical herb called moly to protect him. With it, he resisted Circe's magic, and depending on the version, either threatened her or charmed her into restoring his men. He then spent a year there, comfortably ensconced in her company. A rather long delay, though Circe did have a very nice villa. But even Circe couldn't stall fate forever. Before he could leave, she told him he would need to visit the underworld and consult the spirit of the blind prophet Tiresias. It was the sort of thing Greek heroes were expected to do on long journeys, a little necromancy between islands. So, Odysseus sailed to the edge of the world, sacrificed a ram, and waited while the dead gathered round. Tiresias offered a grim forecast: hardship, loss, and danger. But eventually, if he was careful, Odysseus might reach home. He also saw the shades of his mother, Achilles and Agamemnon, who, you may recall, had recently had a very bad bath. Emerging from the land of the dead with no small amount of existential baggage, Odysseus returned to Circe, who provided more advice. Avoid the sirens, she said, seductive singers who lured sailors to their deaths. Odysseus, ever the curious one, had his men plug their ears with wax while he had himself tied to the mast, just so he could hear their song without succumbing. It was, admittedly, a very Odyssean solution. Practical, perilous, and just a bit arrogant. Next came Scylla and Charybdis, a six-headed monster and a ravenous whirlpool placed inconveniently close together. Odysseus steered toward Scylla, sacrificing a few men rather than risk the entire ship. It's the sort of decision that ancient Greek leaders were expected to make without blinking, though one suspects there were some complaints from the rowing benches. At last, they reached the island of Phrynicia, where sacred cattle belonging to Helios, the sun god, grazed in peace. Odysseus warned his men not to touch them. They promised. And then, while he was napping, they promptly slaughtered and ate several. Helios, unsurprisingly furious, demanded punishment. Zeus obliged with a storm that destroyed the last of Odysseus's crew. Only the man himself survived, clinging to a broken mast, drifting aimlessly until he washed up on the island of Ogygia. Here he met Calypso, a beautiful nymph who offered him immortality if he would stay. It might have seemed like a good deal. No more storms, no more monsters, and an eternity of relaxation. But Odysseus longed for home, for Penelope, for Ithaca. Calypso, both tender and sorrowful, let him go, but not before 7 long years had passed. A different kind of imprisonment, that. Comfort without belonging. At last, with divine help, Odysseus built a raft and sailed once more. Poseidon, still holding a grudge, sent another storm. The poor man could hardly sneeze without attracting weather. He was eventually washed ashore on the land of the Phaeacians, who thankfully turned out to be decent people. They gave him food, clothes, and a proper ship home. After 10 years of wandering, he reached Ithaca at last. But even then, the journey wasn't quite over. His home had been overrun by suitors, dozens of grasping, boastful men courting his wife and feasting in his halls. Disguised as a beggar, Odysseus plotted his revenge. With the help of his son Telemachus, he strung his old bow and dispatched the shooters in a rather bloody finale. Arrows, spears, and poetic justice all around. At last, he revealed himself to Penelope. She, ever cautious, tested him with a secret known only to them: the construction of their bed carved from a rooted olive tree. When Odysseus answered correctly, she wept, and they were reunited. A quiet, hard-won reunion after 20 years apart. Now, what are we to make of all this? On one level, the Odyssey is an adventure, a tapestry of strange lands and strange creatures. But beneath it all lies something deeper, the fear of never getting home, the idea that time might move on without you, that home itself might change, or worse, that you might. Historically, the story reflects the uncertainties of ancient travel. Greek sailors had no maps, no compasses, and very little understanding of ocean currents. Storms, pirates, and unfamiliar coastlines were constant threats. To sail from one island to another could mean weeks of delay or permanent disappearance. The sea was not just a place. It was a personality, and usually a moody one. And yet Odysseus persisted, not because he expected comfort, or glory, or even survival, but because he believed in Ithaca, in Penelope, in the possibility that home, however distant or changed, was worth the journey. So tonight, let us sail gently through the Ionian breeze, past sleepy islands and forgotten shores. Let us follow a man too clever for his own good, drifting not in haste but in hope. Monsters may rise, tempests may howl, but the stars above remain quiet and constant. And somewhere, far across the sea, a lamp is burning in a window. Ithaca waits. Not everyone who fought at Troy ended up in an epic poem or on the side of a vase. Some heroes did not sail home in triumph or wander famously for 10 years. No, some slipped into the margins, their stories quieter, sadder, and mostly uncelebrated. In this chapter, we turn to those figures, brave, flawed, and frankly unlucky, who survived the war but not the peace that followed. First, let us linger a moment with Ajax the Greater, not to be confused with Ajax the Lesser, who will have his own inglorious exit soon enough. Ajax the Greater was a giant of a man, second only to Achilles in strength and battlefield presence. He was a tower of bronze and bellowing rage, fierce in combat and at times a little too proud of it. When Achilles died, slain by a Paris-assisted arrow to the heel, rather inconsiderate of him, there arose a question among the Greeks. Who should inherit his armour? It was no ordinary kit after all. Forged by Hephaestus himself, it glittered like fire and symbolised the might of the Greek war machine. Naturally, both Ajax and Odysseus laid claim to it. Now, Ajax had the stronger argument. He'd fought tirelessly, protected the ships, and retrieved Achilles' body under heavy fire. But Odysseus had the sharper tongue. In a public debate, essentially an early Greek talent show for war resumes, Odysseus spun a more persuasive tale, citing strategy, diplomacy, and the favour of the gods. The audience, swayed by words more than wounds, awarded him the armour. Ajax did not take the loss well. According to Sophocles and later mythographers, Ajax spiralled into a state of humiliated fury. At night, he planned to kill the Greek leaders responsible. But Athena, protective of Odysseus, muddled his mind. In a haze of madness, Ajax slaughtered livestock, thinking they were his enemies. When he awoke and realised what he had done, surrounded by the bloodied corpses of sheep and cattle, he was overcome with shame. He walked away from the camp, planted his sword in the ground, and fell upon it. A brutal, silent end for a man who had fought so loudly. There's something deeply Greek in this. The idea that the true wound is not death in battle, but dishonour in peace. Ajax was not killed by sword or spear, but by a loss of standing, of meaning. A hero without recognition is, in the Greek imagination, barely a man at all. The gods gave him strength, but they did not give him a second act. His death was mourned by many, but especially by his half-brother Teucer, an archer and a steadfast companion throughout the war. Teucer tried to give Ajax a proper burial, but Menelaus and Agamemnon initially forbade it, proof that even corpses had politics in those days. Eventually, Odysseus himself intervened, arguing that Ajax, whatever had happened, was still a great warrior. A small act of decency in a war mostly lacking in them. Teucer, exiled for failing to bring his brother home, wandered off and eventually settled in Cyprus, founding the city of Salamis. Or so the legends say. It's a quieter legacy, no monsters, no divine wrath, just a man trying to put something in the ground that wasn't a weapon. Then there's Philoctetes, perhaps the most reluctant of the heroes. His tale begins not at Troy, but on the way there. He possessed the bow of Heracles, gifted to him as a reward for lighting the funeral pyre of the great hero. This bow, it was foretold, would be needed to win the war. Unfortunately, Philoctetes had a bit of a foot problem. At Lemnos, he was bitten by a snake, a minor thing in most stories, but in this case, the wound festered, it stank, it wept. It made the journey unbearable. His cries disturbed the other warriors, and his smell, well, apparently it was memorable. So, with all the empathy of a conquering army, the Greeks abandoned him on the island, leaving him with his bow, his pain, and a lot of time to think. For years he lived there, wounded and alone. But eventually, when Troy still refused to fall, a prophecy surfaced. The bow of Heracles was indeed required. Cue the awkward return of Greek diplomacy. Odysseus, naturally, was sent to retrieve the man he had once abandoned. He brought with him Neoptolemus, the teenage son of Achilles, another man with a complicated father-shaped shadow to fill. Different versions tell it differently. In some, Neoptolemus wins Philoctetes over with honesty and kindness. In others, he tricks him, only to be overcome with guilt and return the bow. But in the end, Philoctetes is healed, either by divine intervention or Greek medicine, and brought back to Troy. He shoots the arrow that finally fells Paris, and thus completes his unhappy arc. After the war, Philoctetes' story peters out. He's said to have wandered, perhaps founding a city or two, but the myths don't linger on him. His fame, like many others, was tied to a single arrow. When that was loosed, so too was his relevance. And what of Ajax the Lesser? Ah, yes, not to be confused with his more honourable namesake, this Ajax was best known for committing one of the more appalling crimes during the sack of Troy. In the temple of Athena, he assaulted Cassandra, dragging her from the altar and claiming her as a prize. The act was a double outrage, not just against a woman seeking sanctuary, but against the goddess whose temple he violated. Athena did not take it lightly. Though the Greek leaders were divided on how to respond, some wanted to punish him, others looked away. They ultimately allowed him to sail home. It was a decision they'd regret. As his ship sailed through the angry sea, Athena called down a storm. Ajax, cast into the water, clung to a rock and boasted that the gods couldn't kill him. A bit of classic hubris. Poseidon, unimpressed, split the rock and drowned him. In the Greek tradition, no sin goes unpaid, and no arrogance goes uncorrected. Ajax the Lesser's name was blackened. His death was not heroic, it was a warning. Then there are the unnamed and half-named heroes. the foot soldiers, the shipmates, the men who bled and died in the margins. Greek myth, for all its grandeur, has a curious amnesia when it comes to the majority. We hear of their bravery in clusters, the Achaeans, the Danaans, but their individual stories are mostly forgotten. Only the elite, the sons of kings and favourites of gods, get a proper ending. Still, there are echoes. In the epic cycle known as the Nostoi, now mostly lost to time, there were once tales of the other warriors returning home. Men like Idomeneus, king of Crete, who made a rash vow to sacrifice the first living thing he saw upon returning home, only to be greeted by his own son. A story with echoes of the biblical Jephthah, and just as grim. And Eurypylus, son of Telephus, who fought for the Trojans but was killed in a blaze of poetic glory. His story is mostly footnotes now, a few lines in fragmentary poems. And Thersites, a common soldier mocked for his ugliness and impudence, beaten by Odysseus for speaking too freely. A rare glimpse of dissent in a world dominated by kings and demigods. History has never been entirely fair to its lesser heroes. Those who carried the spears, manned the oars, and kept the fires burning seldom earn verses of their own. But their presence, however faint, lingers in the background of myth, like the quiet hum behind a chorus. Archaeologically speaking, the Mycenaean period does show signs of wide-scale collapse around the time of the Trojan War's supposed end. Palaces burned, trade routes disappeared, and many of the great centres were abandoned. Perhaps some of the returning heroes found not the homes they remembered, but smouldering ruins and silence. For many, there may have been no welcome, no bed, no stories. And perhaps that's why the myths settled so often on grief. The Greeks knew that not everyone returned, and that some who did wished they hadn't. The Odyssey gives us the grandeur, but these lesser tales give us the sorrow. So tonight, as we drift through the quieter parts of the mythic map, spare a thought for the heroes who came back broken, or didn't come back at all. For Ajax, whose pride outlived his strength. For Philoctetes, whose wound became his exile. For the countless unnamed who marched to Troy and never saw their islands again. In the dark, between the waves and stars, their stories still float, unfinished, unpolished, but quietly, stubbornly present. If ever there were a face that launched 1,000 ships and exhausted 1,000 poets, it was surely Helen of Troy. Or rather, Helen of Sparta, depending on which part of her life you catch her in. Tonight, we sail away from the battlefields and burning walls, and follow not the warriors, but the women, beginning with Helen herself. When the dust settled and the horse had done its work, the city of Troy was ash and rubble. Fires still smouldered where palaces once stood. The air hung thick with the scent of burnt cedar and blood. In the ruins, women, noble women, priestesses, servants, were rounded up like cattle, the prizes of victory. At the centre of it all stood Helen, beautiful, mysterious, and ever the subject of debate. Some said she had willingly gone to Troy with Paris, bewitched by his charm and Aphrodite's divine meddling. Others insisted she had been taken against her will, a passive prize in a game of gods and kings. In truth, the myths offer no single answer. Helen was either a seductress or a scapegoat, or perhaps a woman simply trying to survive in a world that insisted on making her symbolic. Menelaus, her long-estranged husband, was among the warriors who stormed the city. One might expect him to have run her through with a sword. Instead, the stories tell us that when he found her, standing in her quarters, draped in silks, radiant even in defeat, he dropped his weapon. Overwhelmed by her beauty, his rage faltered. He led her away, not as a captive, but as a wife reclaimed. Or so the version goes. But it is worth pausing to consider what kind of homecoming that was. Helen returned with Menelaus to Sparta, but her reputation did not. In many cities across Greece, she was viewed as the cause of it all, the deaths, the fires, the decade of despair. Though poets might speak of her face with reverence, the common tongue likely preferred curses. And in the plays of Euripides and others, Helen is not a heroine, but a question mark. Was she guilty? Was she powerless? Or was she simply too beautiful to live in peace? In some version of the myth, a phantom Helen was sent to Troy, while the real one remained in Egypt the entire time. This alternate telling, found in Euripides' Helen, was the ancient equivalent of saying it wasn't really her. It's a strange attempt at narrative redemption, one that raises more questions than it answers. But it does speak to the discomfort the Greeks felt about blaming a woman so central to their own self-image. Because if Helen truly went willingly, then she was a traitor. If unwillingly, then she was a victim. But either way, the war became hers to carry. As for Menelaus, his journey home was no smoother than anyone else's. He and Helen wandered for years, blown off course, landing in Egypt among other places. There, they were received by the local king, sometimes Proteus, sometimes another, who treated them with suspicious generosity. The gods were still sorting out the details. Eventually, they made it back to Sparta, older, wearier, and perhaps unsure what they had returned to. It's tempting to imagine them sitting across from one another at dinner, in a palace once full of laughter and song. Now they shared only silence, broken occasionally by the clink of goblets and the shuffle of memories best left undisturbed. In some myths, Helen became a goddess after death. In others, she was exiled, hounded by the Furies, or wandered alone through the mountains. One version even claims she ended her days in Rhodes, where she was hanged by the widow of a fallen Greek soldier. The myths rarely agree on her fate, only on her beauty and the trouble it brought. But Helen, for all her complexities, was not the only woman whose life was shattered by the war. Let us return to the ruins of Troy and speak of the others, those taken as spoils and shipped away to Greek cities where no songs were sung for them. First, Hecuba, Queen of Troy. Once a proud matriarch, she lost nearly all her sons in the war: Hector, Paris, Deiphobus, Troilus, and more. Her husband, King Priam, was butchered at the altar by Achilles' son. Her daughter Polyxena was sacrificed on Achilles' tomb. Her grandson, Astyanax, the infant son of Hector, was thrown from the city walls by the Greeks, so that he might never grow up to avenge his father. A precautionary cruelty, if ever there was one. And Hecuba, she was given to Odysseus, the most diplomatic of the Greeks, but one suspects even he found little comfort in her bitter company. In Euripides' Hecuba, she is transformed from queen to beast by grief. In some versions, she literally becomes a dog, throwing herself into the sea, howling. Myth has a way of externalizing suffering after all. If your sorrow is inhuman, you might as well become something else. Then there was Andromache, Hector's widow, a model of loyalty, modesty, and sorrow. She watched her child murdered and her city burned, and then she was claimed by Neoptolemus, the teenage son of Achilles. It's a pairing that feels particularly cruel, as if the gods were scripting a tragic irony. The wife of the slain prince now handed to the son of his killer. She bore Neoptolemus children, lived for a time in Epirus, and eventually found a kind of quiet life, marrying Helenus, another Trojan survivor, and ruling a small kingdom. But the shadow of Troy never left her. In the Greek world, women like Andromache were both revered and pitied, reminders of what war leaves behind. And what of Cassandra, that doomed prophetess? She had warned them, of course, warned her people about Paris, warned them about the horse, warned them about the fall. But Apollo had cursed her. She could see the future, but no one would ever believe her. The curse of clarity without persuasion, a poetic fate and a cruel one. When the city fell, Cassandra sought refuge in Athena's temple, and there she was assaulted by Ajax the Lesser, dragged from the sacred altar. For this, the gods ensured Ajax would never return home. Cassandra, meanwhile, was given to Agamemnon, taken as a concubine, a spoil. She travelled with him to Mycenae and saw the future again, his murder at the hands of Clytemnestra. Her own death, too. She entered the palace anyway, shoulders squared, walking toward doom with her head held high. In a way, she was the bravest of them all. To know what awaits and go anyway. Cassandra was not just a figure of tragedy, but of perception. In her, the Greeks saw the limits of knowledge. What good is vision if it cannot change the outcome? Her story echoes down the centuries, in every ignored warning and every dismissed truth. These women, Helen, Hecuba, Andromache, Cassandra, they remind us that the Trojan War was not just a saga of men. For every spear thrown, there was a wife waiting. For every city burned, a mother weeping. And in the aftermath, it was often the women who bore the consequences, who were reshaped by survival into something unrecognizable. In Greek drama, particularly the tragedies of Euripides, these female voices are given rare prominence. Perhaps because in their suffering, the Greeks recognized something more universal than glory. The men may have claimed victory, but the women remembered the cost. Historically, the treatment of captured women in ancient warfare was, as one might expect, grim. They were enslaved, traded, kept as concubines. The myths, for all their embellishment, reflect a painful reality, that in war, the fates of women were rarely their own. Their grief, however, became central to the Greek imagination. Even Helen, for all her elevation, remains a figure of ambiguity. She is honoured in some cities, reviled in others. She is remembered less for what she did, and more for what others did because of her. In Sparta, a cult of Helen emerged. Temples were built in her name. She became almost divine. Her beauty, her sorrow, her mythic weight, all transformed into ritual. There's something strange and slightly unsettling in the idea of worshipping a woman whose greatest legacy was a war. And in Troy? Well, there was no Troy anymore. The archaeological site we now call Hisarlik bears the layers of many cities, built and burned over centuries. Whether one of them was the Troy of Homer, we can't say for certain, but the ashes, the walls, the charred remnants, they are real. Someone's city burned. Someone's family was taken. So tonight, let us walk softly among the ruins, past the broken columns and the windswept stones, past the temple steps where Cassandra cried out, past the palace halls where Hecuba once ruled, where Andromache rocked her child to sleep, where Helen stared out over the sea, perhaps wondering what all the beauty had been for. These were not silent women. The myths may have tried to sideline them, but their voices echo, persistent and clear. They remind us that behind every war story lies another, quieter, lonelier, more enduring. And perhaps, if the gods are ever listening, it is these stories they remember best. Tonight we turn our gaze to a boy who entered the Trojan War at its end and departed the world not long after. Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, grandson of Peleus, and great-grandson, on his mother's side, of a man called Lycomedes, who mostly stayed out of the epics. Neoptolemus came late to the war, but made a remarkable impression. In many ways, he was everything his father was, and, perhaps, everything he wasn't. Born on the island of Scyros, Neoptolemus was raised far from the clatter of spears and war cries. His mother, Deidamia, had once known Achilles before he was famous, when he was hidden away by his mother Thetis in an attempt to prevent his doomed fate. Dressed as a girl among the daughters of Lycomedes, Achilles in disguise found love and a son, as one does, apparently, during such awkward arrangements. But destiny has a way of tracking down those who try to avoid it. By the time Neoptolemus was old enough to hold a spear, the Greeks had been at war for nearly a decade. Troy still stood. The warriors were weary, and Achilles was already dead, felled by a poetic arrow guided by Apollo and shot by Paris, who, as we've noted before, rarely did anything without divine assistance. Now, a new prophecy emerged. The Greeks would not win unless they brought the son of Achilles to the battlefield, as if the gods, having taken the father, demanded the child in his place. So Odysseus, ever the recruiter, sailed to Scyros and fetched the boy. Neoptolemus arrived in Troy not as a soldier, but as a symbol, a vessel of inherited wrath. And indeed, he seemed to carry that wrath with great enthusiasm. While Achilles had moments of introspection, hesitation, even grace, Neoptolemus often lacked such subtlety. He was fierce, brutal, and quick to violence. Some ancient writers admired his decisiveness, others found it alarming. In the final days of the war, Neoptolemus earned a reputation both glorious and grim. It was he who killed Priam, the aged king of Troy, right there at the altar of Zeus. While the old man clutched the statue of the god, seeking mercy, Neoptolemus cut him down. No respect for age, sanctuary, or sorrow. The scene, immortalized in later Roman texts like the Aeneid, would haunt generations of storytellers. He also, according to some versions, threw Astyanax, Hector's infant son, from the city walls. A practical act, the Greeks would say. A horrifying one, the rest of us might. The boy, after all, could grow into a man and seek vengeance. And so, Neoptolemus ensured there would be no next generation of Trojans. He was not content to end the war. He wanted to erase its memory. For his efforts, he received Andromache, Hector's widow, as a war prize. And so the woman who had once lain beside the Prince of Troy now found herself bound to the killer's son. A cruel symmetry, if ever there was one. They left Troy together, part of the Greek fleet limping home through unfriendly seas and discontented gods. Some were shipwrecked, others wandered for years, but Neoptolemus somehow made his way to Epirus, a land in northwestern Greece, and carved out a small kingdom there. The myths say he ruled wisely, perhaps mellowed by time and distance, or perhaps just tired. But the fates had not quite finished with him. In some versions, he travelled to Delphi, the sacred sanctuary of Apollo, either to seek guidance or demand justice. There, depending on which story you prefer, he either insulted the priests, desecrated the temple, or simply arrived at the wrong moment. Whatever the cause, he was murdered, either by the temple servants or by Apollo himself. Cut down not in battle, but at the threshold of the god who had once guided Paris's arrow into his father's heel. Poetic again, and deeply Greek. You see, Neoptolemus lived under the long shadow of Achilles, a father who was both legend and ghost. The Greeks were fascinated by inheritance, not just of blood, but of doom. To be the son of a hero was to be born halfway into a story already moving toward tragedy. Achilles had been complex, wrathful, yes, but also capable of mercy. He mourned Patroclus. He returned Hector's body to Priam. There was a strange nobility in him, a tragic beauty. Neoptolemus, by contrast, rarely paused to reflect. He killed with confidence. He ruled with force. And then, like so many others, he vanished young. But the Greeks did not discard him. They gave him cults, shrines, a hero's status. In some corners of the ancient world, he was worshipped alongside his father. Perhaps the Greeks, ambivalent as they were about violence, respected someone who didn't hesitate. Still, his legacy is uneasy. Even the playwright struggled with him. In Sophocles' Philoctetes, we see a different Neoptolemus, a conflicted boy, torn between duty and honour. Odysseus sends him to deceive Philoctetes, to steal the bow of Heracles. But Neoptolemus cannot go through with it. He is drawn to pity, to decency. It's a fascinating portrayal. Not the blood-soaked youth of Troy, but a thoughtful young man trying to make sense of a brutal world. It's hard to say whether Sophocles was offering an alternate version or a redemption arc. Greek tragedy, after all, often reinterpreted its heroes. What mattered was not the facts, such as they were, but the moral weight of the story. Historically speaking, Epirus did indeed have myths connecting it to Neoptolemus and his descendants. The Molossian dynasty, one of the more powerful Greek royal lines, claimed to trace its roots back to him. Through them, so too would Alexander the Great, whose mother Olympias came from that bloodline. Alexander, never one to resist a good myth, was quite pleased by the association. In this way, Neoptolemus lived on, not just in tragedy, but in genealogy. And what of Andromache, who followed him from Troy to Epirus? She bore him sons. One, named Molossus, would become the ancestor of kings. Andromache, so often portrayed as a grieving widow, was also a survivor. In some versions of the myth, after Neoptolemus' death, she married Helenus, the Trojan seer and son of Priam, who had also survived. Together they ruled a small kingdom, a curious echo of Troy on Greek soil. Her journey, from princess to slave to queen, was perhaps the longest of them all. She adapted. She endured. In Greek drama, she is often the voice of memory, of what was lost and what still hurts. The aftershocks of Neoptolemus' brief life rippled far. In Rome, Virgil gives us the Aeneid, where a wandering Trojan, Aeneas, meets Andromache in Epirus. She tells him her tale. A tale of ruins, exile, and quiet resilience. It is a sobering moment, buried in a poem otherwise full of triumphal destiny. Even the Romans, who admired conquest, seemed to pause at her story. And then, as ever, there's the matter of legacy. Neoptolemus left no epics of his own, no Neotolia. He exists as a sequel, an epilogue to Achilles, a footnote to Troy. But in that short space, he managed to kill a king, win a city, and father a dynasty. Not bad for a teenager. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, what if he had lived longer? Would he have grown into a wise king? Would the rage have softened? Or would the fire that burned so brightly simply have burned everything near it? The Greeks were fond of such questions. In their myths, youth is often equated with danger. The young are full of force, but lack temperance. Achilles dies young. Patroclus dies younger. Neoptolemus continues the pattern. The gods, it seems, did not permit long lives to those who shine too brightly. Perhaps that's why Odysseus, older and greyer, survives his journey. Not because he is stronger, but because he is slower, more cautious, more cunning. The flame that flickers lasts longer than the one that blazes. So tonight we leave Neoptolemus not in the blood-stained temple of Delphi, nor on the smoking battlements of Troy, but somewhere in the quiet hills of Epirus, a young man still learning how to wield a crown. Perhaps he stands at the edge of a cliff, wind tugging at his cloak, staring out at the sea his father once crossed, wondering if he is meant for more than war. Or perhaps not. Perhaps his story ends exactly as it should. Brief, brilliant, and sharp-edged. A warning and a memory. The kind of hero whose fire lit up the sky, if only for a moment. There are homecomings, and then there are Greek homecomings, where the phrase "welcome back" is often followed by murder. And no tale of post-Trojan drama better captures this grim tradition than that of Agamemnon, High King of Mycenae, brother to Menelaus, leader of the Greek forces, and, depending on whom you ask, either a victorious hero or a monumentally unlucky husband. Let us begin at the beginning, or rather, the very inconvenient middle. Before Agamemnon ever set sail for Troy, he made what we might call a tactical error in the eyes of the gods. While preparing the fleet, he killed a sacred stag belonging to Artemis and then boasted about it. Now, if there's one thing Greek gods do not tolerate, it is mortals making noise about how clever or powerful they are, especially when they've just murdered divine wildlife. Artemis responded in kind. She stilled the winds, trapping the Greek fleet in Aulis. No sailing, no war, no progress. The solution, a sacrifice, a human one. Enter Iphigenia, Agamemnon's daughter. He lured her to Aulis under the pretense of marrying her to Achilles. The usual wedding lie. When she arrived, instead of a ceremony, she got an altar. The accounts diverge. Some say Artemis snatched her away at the last moment and replaced her with a deer. Others say the blade fell. Either way, Clytemnestra, Agamemnon's wife and Iphigenia's mother, was not amused. Now fast forward 10 years. Troy is in ruins. Agamemnon is finally coming home, bringing with him not just spoils of war, but Cassandra, the Trojan princess and prophetess, as a concubine. Yes, quite the diplomatic choice. Bringing the enemy king's daughter and your own mistress home, after killing your daughter and being gone for a decade. Even Odysseus might have raised an eyebrow. As his ship approached Mycenae, Agamemnon would have seen the familiar cliffs and olive groves of his kingdom, the walls of his palace shining in the sun, and perhaps, just perhaps, he imagined a peaceful return, a soft bed, a hot meal, his people singing of his glory. What he got was Clytemnestra. While he had been off conquering, she had been stewing. 10 years is a long time to hold a grudge, but Clytemnestra was nothing if not patient. She had also taken a lover, Aegisthus, cousin to Agamemnon, and a man with his own complicated family tree. This wasn't merely a matter of betrayal. It was lineage, revenge, and domestic theatre, all in one. According to Aeschylus, when Agamemnon arrived, Clytemnestra greeted him warmly, a little too warmly. She rolled out a purple carpet, a colour reserved for the gods, and invited him to walk upon it. Agamemnon, slightly wary, hesitated. Walking on such fabric was a display of arrogance, practically daring divine punishment. But eventually he relented and entered the palace. He never walked out again. There are several versions of his murder. Some say Clytemnestra lured him into a bath, entangled him in robes, and then stabbed him. Others say she used an axe, or perhaps a sword, with Aegisthus dealing the final blow. The details differ, but the outcome does not. The High King, triumphant in Troy, died naked and unguarded in his own home, cut down not by enemy swords, but by a vengeful wife and a jealous cousin. And Cassandra? She had foreseen all of it. She had seen the palace, the blood, her own end, but true to her curse, no one believed her. Even as she stepped into the house, she knew it was a tomb, and yet she went, calm, resigned, perhaps tired of always knowing what no one else could see. She was killed beside Agamemnon, her death adding a final insult to the Trojan tragedy. Now, to pause briefly for the historical note, Mycenae, as a real place, was one of the great palace complexes of the late Bronze Age. Walls of massive stone blocks, a lion gate still standing today, and shaft graves filled with gold. The Mycenaean rulers may have inspired the later myths, their splintered histories providing the backdrop for tales of ambition and blood. And Agamemnon. His so-called tomb was uncovered by Heinrich Schliemann in the 19th century. A grand grave with a golden mask. The archaeologists remained sceptical about whose bones lay inside, but the poetry endures. Back to the myth, the murder of Agamemnon did not bring peace. It merely shifted the curse down a generation. For you see, Agamemnon had a son, Orestes, and a daughter, Electra. They had waited, grown up under the shadow of a murdered father and a mother-turned monarch. In most versions, Orestes was sent away as a child for his safety, but the gods, or at least the playwrights, would not let him rest. Years later, Orestes returned to Mycenae. Like so many Greek stories, this too became a question of duty versus morality. Apollo had commanded him to avenge his father, but to do so, he would have to commit matricide, to kill his own mother. Even in the flexible ethics of myth, this was a dark and terrible dilemma. Orestes hesitated, but not for long. With the help of Electra, who had her own catalogue of grievances, he crept into the palace. In some versions, he killed Aegisthus first, then Clytemnestra. In others, he hesitated at the final moment, overcome by horror, only to finish the deed as she begged for her life. The result was the same. The house of Atreus, never particularly blessed, was awash in blood once more. But justice, in the Greek sense, never comes clean. No sooner had Orestes avenged his father than he was pursued by the Furies, or Erinyes, ancient goddesses of vengeance. They hounded him day and night, clawing at his mind, whispering guilt into every shadow. He wandered, sleepless and raving, a man driven mad by the price of justice. Eventually, he found his way to Athens, where Athena herself presided over his trial. This moment, dramatized in Aeschylus's Eumenides, marks one of the first symbolic shifts in Greek literature. From vengeance to law, from blood feud to courtroom. Athena cast the deciding vote in his favour, and the Furies, pacified, transformed into the Eumenides, the kindly ones. a tidy ending, though one suspects the family dinners remained awkward. As for Clytemnestra, she too lingers in myth, a ghost never quite exorcised. Some saw her as monstrous, a wife who betrayed her king. Others, especially in later literature, cast her as tragic, a woman who had suffered too long, too deeply to remain silent. Her act was unforgivable, yes, but perhaps also inevitable. Greek myth was never terribly interested in happy marriages. They were stories of passion, betrayal, revenge, the kind of things that made for good theatre and terrible family life. In Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, we see the collision of power and pain. A king who sacrificed his daughter for wind, a queen who waited 10 years to strike, and a son caught in the middle. Even the name House of Atreus carries weight. Atreus, Agamemnon's father, had his own scandalous past. He once murdered his brother's children and fed them to him at a banquet. Yes, a family dinner where the main course was revenge. The curse that followed them all, Agamemnon, Orestes, and even Electra, was said to have begun there, in blood and deceit. It's almost as if the Greeks were trying to tell us something about inheritance. To the ancient mind, families could carry curses as surely as they carried wealth. The sins of the father, and grandfather, and great-uncle were not easily forgotten. The gods might forgive. The Furies would not. And perhaps that's why the tragedy of Agamemnon strikes such a deep chord. It isn't about a king dying in war. It's about what happens after. The slow rot beneath the golden throne, the wife pacing the palace year after year, the child who must decide which parent to betray. There's a quiet horror to it. No monsters, no sieges, no divine thunderbolts. Just the simple terror of returning home to find everything waiting, and none of it good. Tonight, then, let us walk through the palace halls of Mycenae. The hearths are cold. The walls still smell faintly of cedar and blood. Shadows flicker where once kings dined and children played. Perhaps we hear the echo of Cassandra's warning, or the creak of purple carpets beneath sandaled feet. Here, in these stones, the past does not rest. It broods. So let the night fall softly. Let the torches gutter and the marble chill. And remember that not every victory ends in cheers. Sometimes it ends in silence and the slow closing of a door. After the siege of Troy had finally crumbled into dust and ash, the Greeks, those few who had survived the gods, the Trojans and one another, prepared to sail home. Some did not make it past the shoreline, others would never arrive at all, and a few, like Menelaus, king of Sparta, would find themselves dragged on a journey so improbable that it would seem they'd offended not only the gods but perhaps time itself. Menelaus, you'll remember, was the man whose wife, Helen, was spirited away by Paris, thus igniting a 10-year war of mud, blood, and badly timed prophecies. When Troy fell and the smoke cleared, Helen was returned to him, though returned may be too neat a word for what happened. Whether she came willingly, whether she was taken, or whether she had simply grown tired of Paris and ready for the next chapter, we shall never know. What we do know is that she was there on the Trojan shoreline when Menelaus gathered his ships, looking every bit as lovely as she had when the war began. He, on the other hand, had aged. 10 years of siege can do that to a man. They boarded the same ship, perhaps sitting side by side in silence, with only the creaking of oars and the gentle accusation of memory between them. What does one say, really, after all that? So, where were we? Their journey home should have been swift. Sparta was not far, relatively speaking, but the gods had other plans. The Greeks had committed various crimes on their way out of Troy, looting temples, killing supplicants, desecrating sacred spaces. Athena, in particular, had been slighted, and her wrath hung over the fleet like a thundercloud. While some ships were wrecked outright and others scattered, Menelaus's took a more circuitous route, an accidental grand tour of the Mediterranean, if you like, with storms, shipwrecks, and sea monsters included. One of the more exotic stops on this journey was Egypt. Yes, Egypt. Now it might seem strange that a Greek king would end up in Egypt on his way home, but the ancient world was far more connected than it sometimes appears. Trade routes stretched across the seas, and foreign ports were frequented by all manner of adventurers, merchants, and evidently stranded kings with missing wives. In fact, some versions of the myth, like those found in Herodotus, suggest that Helen never went to Troy at all. According to that version, Paris was blown off course and landed in Egypt with Helen in tow. There, the Egyptian king, horrified that Paris had abducted another man's wife, promptly took her into protective custody. Paris was sent away, and the real Helen remained in Egypt throughout the entire war, while a phantom Helen, an illusion, was in Troy. It's a rather elegant narrative solution, really. If true, it means the Greeks fought a 10-year war over a cloud, literally. The gods, it seems, had a taste for irony. But in most versions, Helen did go to Troy, and it was during the return from Troy that Menelaus found himself in Egypt, with his real, and possibly somewhat awkward, wife beside him. There, the myths tell us, he met Proteus, a prophetic sea god and old man of the sea who could shift shape at will. Proteus was not the sort of being one simply interviewed. He had to be captured, physically pinned down, and held through all his transformations until he relented and spoke. And so, following local advice, Menelaus crept upon Proteus while he napped on the shore among his seals, yes, seals, and wrestled him into submission as he morphed into fire, water, a lion, a serpent, and various other alarming shapes. Menelaus held on. One imagines him swearing quietly throughout, until the god gave up and agreed to speak. Proteus, apparently impressed or simply annoyed, told Menelaus how to appease the gods and continue his journey. Sacrifices would be required, as always, and some divine grovelling. He also informed Menelaus that his brother Agamemnon had been murdered upon returning home. One imagines that news landing like a stone in Menelaus's chest. Victorious, yes, but at what cost? Eventually, with the proper rites performed and favourable winds at last, Menelaus and Helen continued their return voyage. It is said that their journey took 8 years in total. 8 years to come home to a city that had once sung their names, now perhaps quiet with confusion or resentment. And here's where the myth gets complicated. Menelaus and Helen resumed their rule in Sparta. Their homecoming, unlike Agamemnon's, was not met with knives. The palace gates opened, the hearth fires were lit, the people bowed, and yet something must have shifted between them. A decade apart. A war. A long sail through hostile waters. A marriage frayed by the gods themselves. In Homer's Odyssey, when Telemachus visits Sparta in search of news of his father, Odysseus, he finds Menelaus and Helen living in elegant domesticity, surrounded by servants, tapestries, and quiet luxury. Helen, ever the gracious hostess, offers potions to ease sorrow, pours wine, and reminisces about the old days. Her beauty intact, her memory selective. In one scene, she casually tells of how, during the Trojan War, she had once walked the walls of Troy and mimicked the voices of the Greek wives below, trying to lure the soldiers out from the belly of the wooden horse. A chilling little anecdote. Her voice, calling to them in the voices of their beloveds. Whether she did it in jest, or malice, or confusion, is left ambiguous. Homer, with his characteristic subtlety, lets the moment pass unjudged. Menelaus listens. He does not interrupt. Perhaps he's heard the story before. But Homer also gives Menelaus a unique fate. While most Greek heroes die bloody deaths or vanish into obscurity, Menelaus is rewarded. According to Book 4 of the Odyssey, he will not die at all. Because he is the husband of Helen, daughter of Zeus, he is destined to be sent at the end of his life to the Elysian fields, a sort of Greek paradise at the edge of the world, where the air is always mild, the sun never too hot, and heroes may relax without fear of divine punishment. It's an odd reward, given how much trouble he endured, but perhaps the gods felt he'd earned it. As for Helen, her later fate is as inconsistent as ever. In Sparta, she was worshipped after her death, or perhaps even before it. A temple to Helen stood there, and offerings were made in her name. Some said she had been taken to Olympus, made divine by Zeus himself. Others claimed she fled to Rhodes, where she was hanged by the widow of one of the Greek warriors who died at Troy, a bitter form of justice. And in some strange accounts, she even married again to Achilles himself in the afterlife, reunited in the Isles of the Blessed, where mythologies merge and old enmities are forgotten. But the Menelaus-Helen saga remains one of the most enigmatic. There are no great battles in their post-war tale, no wrath of Achilles, no suitors slain, just the slow, strange return of two people bound together by fate, reputation, and possibly very little else. And what do we make of Menelaus then? He is not the most glamorous of the Greeks, not the strongest, not the cleverest. He does not give stirring speeches or launch dramatic solo attacks. But he endures. He reclaims his wife. He survives the gods. He returns home. He is, in some ways, the everyman of the epic. Less radiant than Achilles, less sly than Odysseus, but steady. Slightly bewildered, often wrong-footed, but never broken. In the Iliad, he fights bravely but without glory. In the Odyssey, he rules with calm dignity. He is both cuckold and king, hero and husband. A man who simply wants his home, his wife, and a little peace. Which, given the state of the Greek mythological world, is quite the ambition. Historically, Sparta in the late Bronze Age may indeed have been the seat of a powerful ruler. Its later martial reputation, so famous in the classical period, was not yet fully formed. Instead, it was a place of trade, of sanctuaries, of richly decorated tombs. Menelaus and Helen, if they lived at all, would have ruled over a land of olive groves, river valleys, and slowly fading Mycenaean splendour. Perhaps they walked together in the evenings, king and queen of a world already slipping into legend. Perhaps they said very little to each other. Perhaps they had said everything during the war, and the silence was what came next. Tonight, then, let us drift with them on those endless Mediterranean waters. The ship gently rocking, the stars above foreign shores, Proteus shifting in his sleep somewhere beneath the waves, the long way home stretching onwards, lined with omens and olive trees. And if the gods allow, perhaps, just perhaps, the sea will stay calm until morning. Some men return from war with scars and silence, others with treasure. But Odysseus, king of Ithaca, returned with stories, a great many of them. Whether he embellished a bit along the way, or a great deal, is beside the point. Tonight, we join him not for his triumphs, but for his meandering, frequently interrupted, occasionally bizarre 10-year journey home. Because for Odysseus, the war was only half the problem. The rest was everything else. The Odyssey, attributed to Homer, begins after Troy, and it opens not with the king himself, but with his household in disarray. His wife, Penelope, is weaving and unweaving a shroud each night to stave off aggressive suitors. His son, Telemachus, is awkward, moody, and increasingly suspicious that his father is never coming back. And the kingdom of Ithaca is slowly, inevitably, becoming someone else's. But where is Odysseus? Stranded, as it happens, on an island with a goddess. Her name is Calypso, and she is in no hurry to let him leave. For 7 years, she keeps him in a kind of bittersweet captivity, offering him immortality, love, and a worry-free existence. He declines, which may strike you as a strange choice. Immortality and divine companionship are nothing to sneeze at. But Odysseus, for all his cleverness, is a man fixated on home. Even if home is full of suitors drinking his wine and eyeing his wife. Eventually the gods intervene. Hermes arrives with a message from Zeus. Let him go. Calypso, grumbling, obeys. Odysseus builds a raft and sets sail, only to be shipwrecked almost immediately by Poseidon, who still holds a grudge. The sea god had never forgiven Odysseus for blinding his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus. More on that shortly. He washes up on the shores of Scheria, home of the Phaeacians, who are helpful, curious, and crucially enjoy a good tale. Here, Odysseus finally begins to recount what's happened since Troy. His adventures unfold in a long, winding flashback, a kind of dinner party storytelling session with a side of trauma. It begins with his first detour, Ismarus, land of the Cicones, where his men plunder a town only to be ambushed in return. A tactical misstep, if we're being generous. Next, the Lotus Eaters. Harmless, dreamy folk who offer his crew fruit that makes them forget everything, including the desire to return home. Odysseus has to physically drag his men back to the ships. It's the first hint that homecoming, for some, might not be as appealing as advertised. Then comes the Cyclops. Odysseus and his crew stumble upon the cave of Polyphemus, a one-eyed shepherd of considerable size and poor manners. They help themselves to his cheese and wine, rude, and are promptly trapped inside. Polyphemus begins eating them one by one. Odysseus, ever the schemer, tells the Cyclops his name is nobody, gets him drunk, and drives a sharpened stake into his eye while he sleeps. The next morning, when Polyphemus howls for help, the other Cyclopes ask who's hurting him. "Nobody," he bellows, and so they leave him alone. A clever trick, but one that comes with a price. As they flee, Odysseus shouts his real name back to the blinded Cyclops, because of course he does. Pride. It undoes many a Greek hero. Polyphemus prays to his father, Poseidon, to curse Odysseus, and the sea god obliges. From here, it all unravels. At Aeolia, the god Aeolus gives Odysseus a bag containing all the winds, a rather generous gift. So close to Ithaca they can see the shoreline, Odysseus's crew, suspecting treasure, opens the bag. The winds explode, The ship is thrown back to Aeolia, and this time Aeolus refuses to help. Understandably. Next stop, Laestrygonians, giant cannibals. They destroy most of his fleet and eat quite a few men. Only one ship escapes. Then, Circe, a sorceress who turns men into pigs. Odysseus, aided by Hermes, resists her magic and becomes her lover instead. They stay a year. It's becoming a theme. Circe eventually helps him with directions, but to proceed, he must visit the underworld and speak with the prophet Tiresias. Down he goes, offering blood and prayers. In the gloom of Hades, he meets the ghost of Elpenor, one of his men who fell off a roof. He sees his mother, long dead. He speaks to Achilles, who admits that he'd rather be a poor farmer among the living than a lord among the dead. Even the great heroes, it seems, tire of their own glory. From the dead, Odysseus returns to Circe, then sets off again. Next, the sirens. Their song lures sailors to their deaths. Odysseus, ever curious, wants to hear it. He plugs his men's ears with wax and ties himself to the mast. The song is haunting, irresistible, but he cannot move, and so they pass safely. Then Scylla and Charybdis, a six-headed monster on one side, a deadly whirlpool on the other. They sail between the two, losing men to Scylla's snapping heads. It's not exactly a win, but it's better than total annihilation. Eventually, they land on Thrinacia, island of Helios, the sun god. They are warned not to touch his sacred cattle. Odysseus insists they obey, but when food runs out, his men predictably slaughter the cows. Helios complains to Zeus, who sends a storm to destroy the ship. Only Odysseus survives. He clings to driftwood, floats for days, and washes up on Ogygia, the island of Calypso. And thus the loop is complete. Back in the present, the Phaeacians, moved by his tale, offer Odysseus passage home. Poseidon, still cranky, turns their ship to stone. But Odysseus at last sets foot on Ithaca. He doesn't announce himself immediately. Always cautious, always calculating. Disguised as a beggar, thanks to Athena's help, he enters his own palace and surveys the chaos. Over 100 suitors have taken residence, drinking, feasting, and pressing Penelope to choose a new husband. Penelope, for her part, has stalled brilliantly. She told them she'd choose once she finished weaving a shroud for Odysseus's father. Each night she undid her day's work. For 3 years they were fooled. Eventually they caught her. But still she held firm. A woman of quiet genius, Odysseus, still disguised, is mocked by the suitors. He endures it, waits, plans. Finally he reveals himself, by stringing his old bow and shooting an arrow through 12 axe heads, a feat no one else could match. Then he kills them all, every last suitor, with arrows, swords, and help from his son and a few loyal servants. The great hall of Ithaca is soaked in blood. The crime, in Homer's eyes, is not vengeance, but hospitality violated. These men overstepped, and now the reckoning has come. But even after this, peace is not guaranteed. The families of the slain suitors rise up, ready to continue the cycle. Athena intervenes. A fragile truce is declared. And finally, the home that Odysseus longed for becomes his again, not just in bricks and walls, but in name and rule and quiet. Now the curious thing about Odysseus is that his tale doesn't end there. In some later traditions, Odysseus doesn't stay home. One version claims he grows restless and sets off again, this time westward, beyond the known world, seeking to find where the sea ends. Others say he was eventually killed by his own son, Telegonus, born of Circe. who arrives unknowingly in Ithaca and strikes down his father by mistake with a poisoned spear. A rather Greek ending, that, fated, ironic, and familial. But in Homer's version, Odysseus remains. Older, weathered, a king once more. Historically, the island of Ithaca, or rather, the various locations claiming to be it, has been the subject of much scholarly debate. Some archaeologists believe the Homeric Ithaca may not align with the modern island bearing the name. Others insist it does. Regardless, the Odyssey captures the essence of what it meant to be Greek in that age: to travel, to long for home, and to be wary of gifts from strangers. Odysseus stands apart from the other Greek heroes. Achilles sought glory, Agamemnon, power, Menelaus, perhaps, restoration. But Odysseus sought survival. He lies, cheats, weeps, hides, yet endures. He is flawed, brilliant, deeply human. The gods both love and torment him. The world resists him, but he adapts, he thinks. And slowly, painfully, he wins. And so tonight, let us rest beside him, our clever king, finally still. The storm has passed, the hearth is warm, the suitors are gone. Penelope sleeps nearby. The long oar lies in the corner silent. And perhaps, just perhaps, Odysseus dreams not of monsters or witches, but of olive trees, and the smell of bread baking, and the sound of waves brushing softly against the shore of home. It is one thing to be the hero of a great war, quite another to be the son of one. If Odysseus endured storms and monsters, his son Telemachus faced a different kind of trial altogether. The quiet, grating kind of hardship that involves waiting, watching, and wondering whether your father is ever coming home, or if the songs sung about him are more flattering than factual. When the Odyssey opens, Telemachus is no longer a boy, but not quite a man. He is, to borrow a Greek word, nepios, still soft of chin and uncertain of purpose. He lives in a palace overrun by suitors, where the food is being eaten, the wine poured too freely, and the servants uncertain where their loyalties lie. His mother Penelope weaves in the day and unweaves in the night, stalling the inevitable. But time, like the gods, waits for no one. And so, Telemachus is forced into an uncomfortable position. Half prince, half hostage, drifting through his own halls like a ghost of what should have been. No father, no control, only whispers of glory and an ever-tightening knot of expectation. Eventually, Athena, as is often the case when men are floundering, steps in. Disguised as mentor, a name which would later be borrowed for the role of any wise advisor, though here it's quite literal. She encourages the lad to do something positively un-Greek. Talk about his feelings and make a plan. Telemachus, emboldened by divine pep talk, sets off on a small but significant voyage. He sails to Pylos to visit Nestor, the venerable king and veteran of Troy, and then to Sparta, where Menelaus and Helen are holding court in relative serenity. In both places, he asks the same question: "Have you seen my father?" The answers are vague, scattered. Odysseus is alive, perhaps, or dead, or something in between. But the journey itself is more important than the destination. For the first time, Telemachus acts. He steps beyond the shadow of absence and into the uncertain light of selfhood. Meanwhile, Odysseus is making his own belated return. When the two are reunited in Ithaca, it is not the tearful embrace of storybooks. Odysseus, in disguise, reveals himself carefully. Telemachus does not know what to believe. The man has been gone for 20 years. He has, perhaps, become more myth than father. But belief once lit is hard to extinguish. They scheme together, they strike together, and in the end they stand side by side over the corpses of the shooters. Father and son united not in words, but in shared purpose and spilled blood. Yet what happens after the vengeance? After the hall has been cleaned, the bough hung, and the island quiet once more? Here the stories splinter. In some versions, Telemachus becomes king after Odysseus' eventual death. In others, he leaves Ithaca behind entirely. One tradition, found in later Greek sources, claims that Telemachus marries Circe. Yes, that's Circe, the enchantress who once turned his father's men into pigs. In an act of mythological neatness, Odysseus' son and his former lover build a new dynasty on the island of Aiaia. Together, they have a son named Latinus, who, depending on your source, goes on to found part of Italy. The myth is fluid, as always, and the past has a tendency to loop back on itself in peculiar ways. There's also the tale of Telegonus, Circe's son with Odysseus. In one particularly ironic telling, Telegonus grows up unaware of his father's identity, sails off to find him, and accidentally kills him with a spear tipped with the venom of a stingray. In a gesture of mythical symmetry, he then marries Penelope, his father's widow, and Telemachus marries Circe. And so the entire family becomes a kind of mythological Rubik's Cube, scrambled, reconfigured, but somehow still functional. Let's take a moment to exhale. These tales, shifting and contradictory, are not meant to be consistent. The Greeks didn't worry about canon the way we do. Instead, they allowed their myths to breathe, expand, and change with the needs of each city, each poet, each generation. Telemachus, then, isn't a single character. He is an idea, a young man caught between legacy and identity, between the weight of his father's name and the pressure to make his own. Historically, the role of sons in ancient Greece was a serious business. Inheritance passed from father to son. The son was expected to honour the household gods, to maintain the family reputation, and to perform the funeral rites without fail. A man without sons was, in a sense, erased from the ongoing story of his oikos, his household, his lineage. Yet, as in myth, the position of sons was rarely simple. Take Orestes, son of Agamemnon, who we discussed in chapter 7. He avenged his father by killing his mother. Not exactly a tale you'd want performed at your birthday feast. Or Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, who went to war after his father died, took a central role in Troy's final destruction, and eventually met a murky end, killed in some stories by Orestes no less. Greek myth is a tangled net, and everyone gets caught eventually. These sons often inherited not only lands and titles, but the consequences of divine feuds, ancestral curses, and badly timed oracles. For every golden shield passed down, there seemed to be a family ghost lurking in the vestibule. Even Aeneas, a Trojan rather than a Greek, fits this mould. The son of Anchises and the goddess Aphrodite, Aeneas carries his aged father on his back out of burning Troy, a moving image that would echo down through Roman poetry. He is the dutiful son, chosen by fate to found what will one day become Rome. Yet his path, too, is laden with war, wandering and loss. These sons, like Telemachus, grew up not in the warmth of victory, but in the cold ash of aftermath. They inherited stories and wounds, and the knowledge that the age of heroes was slipping away, replaced not by peace, but by memory. There is something strangely modern about Telemachus. He is not interested in glory for its own sake. He is thoughtful, hesitant, observant. When Homer describes him in the Odyssey, it is often in quiet terms. He listens more than he speaks. He weighs each word. He watches his mother's sorrow and understands it without being consumed by it. He is, if you like, the transitional figure between the old world and the new. Odysseus is a man of cleverness, disguise, and decisive action. Telemachus is a man of reflection, diplomacy, and restraint. He stands at the threshold of myth and history, a figure shaped by the echoes of war, but not beholden to them. In this way, he speaks to the later Greeks, those of the classical period, who looked back on the Age of Heroes as a time of both splendour and savagery. Telemachus becomes a bridge, linking the impulsive blood feuds of the past with the more measured civic virtues of the present. And yet, he is still a son, still waiting for a father, still learning, as all sons must, that the man you idolize is rarely the man you get. Odysseus returns not as a shining hero, but as a weary, wily stranger who must be relearned, retrusted, reloved. Their relationship is not forged on battlefields, but around the slow rebuilding of a life interrupted. What remains of Telemachus in the end is not his name in epic songs, nor his slaying of suitors, nor his potential marriage to a sorceress. What lingers is the quiet dignity of his arc, a young man growing up in the long shadow of war, and finding, however haltingly, his own way forward. And perhaps that is the final message of these post-Trojan tales, that while the heroes crashed and burned in spectacular fashion, stabbed in bathtubs, drowned at sea, cursed by gods, their children carried on. They endured. They inherited not just the chaos, but the slow business of healing, of ruling, of remembering. For myth is not just the story of how wars are won, it is the story of what happens after. The rebuilding, the forgiveness, the inevitable forgetting. Telemachus, and others like him, remind us that every heroic age must end, and when it does, it falls to quieter hands to pick up the pieces. So tonight, let us imagine Telemachus in Ithaca, not the awkward boy scanning the sea for a sail, but the man walking the halls of a repaired palace. The roof mended, the suitors gone. The name of his father still spoken, but no longer clung to. Penelope weaving not in dread, but in peace. The wind outside is gentle, the stars indifferent. And somewhere in the corner, the great bow of Odysseus gathers dust. The age of heroes has ended. The age of men and memory has begun. Let us begin not with bloodshed, but with a party. A grand one at that. The kind of divine wedding that demands golden goblets, celestial harpists, and the sort of banquet where mortals are most definitely not invited. The setting is somewhere between the heavens and the wine-dark sea. The marriage of Peleus, a mortal king, and Thetis, a sea nymph of surpassing beauty and uncertain temperament. One day she's calming the waves, the next she's turning into a fire-breathing lioness. You know how it is with sea nymphs? Slippery in every sense of the word. Now, this was not your average wedding. The gods themselves were in attendance, Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, even Dionysus, who no doubt came for the wine and stayed for the drama. You see, it had been prophesied that Thetis's child would one day outshine his father. Naturally, the gods, being the divine equivalent of power-hungry middle managers, decided that none of them fancied raising a demigod who might overthrow them. So they married her off to a mortal instead. The lucky man, Peleus, a respectable enough Thessalian warrior who probably didn't ask too many questions. Now, here is where our story begins to turn from celebration to catastrophe. You see, someone was not invited to the wedding. That someone was Eris, goddess of strife, discord, and all things inconvenient. Think of her as the divine embodiment of a poorly timed group text. Snubbed and seething, Eris did what anyone in her position might do. She showed up anyway and brought a gift. A golden apple, shining and lovely, with 3 little words carved into its surface. To the fairest. She tossed it into the hall, watched the room grow quiet, and likely walked away with a satisfied smirk. The gods, one might think, would be above petty squabbles over a shiny piece of fruit. But no, dignity fled the building faster than Hermes on market day. 3 goddesses laid claim to the apple. Hera, queen of Olympus, Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, and Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and complicating everything. Each one believed herself the rightful recipient, and each was, in her own way, terrifying enough to make the others second-guess it. Faced with this celestial beauty contest, the gods did what many bureaucracies do when confronted with a no-win scenario. They passed the problem to someone else. Enter Paris, Prince of Troy, a man whose later decisions would suggest that judgment was not his strong suit. But at this moment, he was a shepherd on Mount Ida, having been quietly removed from royal life due to a prophecy that he would one day cause the destruction of Troy. Naturally, his family decided to abandon him as a child. You know, just in case. Still, he grew up handsome and healthy and, more importantly, utterly unprepared to referee a divine pageant. The 3 goddesses appeared before Paris, not in mortal modesty, mind you, but in full divine radiance. Each offered him a bribe. Hera promised power, kingship over all of Asia. Athena offered wisdom and victory in battle. But Aphrodite, always knowing her audience, promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, thinking like a young man and not a geopolitical strategist, handed the apple to Aphrodite, and thus the world began to burn. Now, who exactly was this most beautiful woman in the world? Her name was Helen, Queen of Sparta, daughter of Zeus and Leda, or possibly Nemesis, depending on which version you read. She had been courted by many Greek kings, all of whom had once nearly come to blows over her. To avoid conflict, her mortal father, King Tyndareos, had made all the suitors swear an oath that they would respect Helen's choice, and if anyone ever took her away, they would all band together to bring her back. An early example of what you might call a foreign policy nightmare waiting to happen. Helen eventually chose Menelaus, a capable if somewhat humorless king of Sparta. They were married, and for a time, things were peaceful. That is, until Paris showed up at court under the pretense of diplomacy, and then, with Aphrodite's encouragement, either seduced or abducted Helen. It rather depends on the source. In Homer's Iliad, Helen seems weary, regretful, and passive. In Euripides' version, she's more assertive. Later poets go further, claiming Helen never even went to Troy, just a phantom version, while the real one sat out the war in Egypt like a mildly annoyed chess piece. Whichever version you choose, the result is the same. Paris sails back to Troy with Helen, and Menelaus, enraged, calls in every king, prince, and warrior who once pledged an oath to protect her. And this is where myth begins to collide with history. Scholars have long debated whether the Trojan War actually happened. Was there a real conflict between Mycenaean Greeks and a city on the coast of Anatolia, one perhaps called Wilusa, a name that bears uncanny resemblance to Ilium, another name for Troy? Archaeological digs at Hisarlik, the presumed site of Troy, reveal a city that was destroyed, not once, but several times, by fire and war. Trade routes passed through this region. Riches flowed, conflicts surely followed, so while gods may not have hurled spears from Olympus, someone likely hurled something over those walls. And now, back to myth, the Greeks began to assemble. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and brother to Menelaus, took charge. Not because he was particularly loved, he wasn't, but because he had the ships, the swords, and a rather loud voice. Other kings answered the call. Odysseus, the clever one, Nestor, the talkative one, Ajax, the strong and silent type, and most famously Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, the very couple whose wedding had started this mess in the first place. Achilles was a prince of Phthia, raised by a centaur named Chiron, as you do, and trained to be the greatest warrior of his age. His mother, fearing he would die young, dipped him in the river Styx to make him invulnerable, everywhere except the heel by which she held him. This, of course, gives us the term Achilles' heel, and reminds us that even the mightiest have their soft spots, sometimes quite literally. But not all heroes were eager to join the war. Odysseus, ever the tactician, feigned madness to avoid leaving his young son. He yoked an ox and a donkey to a plough, and began sowing salt into his fields, until a clever Greek placed his infant son in front of the plough. Odysseus swerved, proving he was sane, and was promptly dragged off to war. Achilles, too, was hidden, disguised as a girl among the daughters of King Lycomedes. This plan lasted until Odysseus came bearing trinkets and weapons, laying them out before the maidens. Achilles naturally went straight for the sword. Boys will be boys, even when wearing a dress. So the ships assembled, 1,000 of them, legend says, and the winds were ready. Or were they? At the port of Aulis, the fleet was becalmed. The gods, you see, were not so easily manipulated. Artemis, goddess of the hunt, had been offended, likely by Agamemnon, who either boasted of his skill or killed a sacred deer. As a result, she demanded a price: the sacrifice of Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia. This is one of those moments where Greek myth takes a very sharp turn from pageantry to tragedy. Agamemnon hesitated. Understandably so, but in the end, ambition won out over love. Iphigenia was lured to Aulis under the promise of marriage to Achilles, and there she was sacrificed. Some versions offer a gentler ending. Artemis whisked her away at the last moment and left a deer in her place, but most tell it straight. Agamemnon killed his daughter, and the winds began to blow. It was a grim start to a grim war, and so, with divine grudges simmering, oaths invoked, and personal tragedies mounting, the 1,000 ships set sail for Troy, not knowing they would remain there for 10 years, the cost of their pride and vengeance, and certainly not knowing that by the time it ended, nearly all of them would be dead, disgraced, or eternally wandering. But that, dear listener, is a tale for the next chapter. For now, rest easy, for even the greatest war in myth began not with a sword, but with a wedding, an insult, and a single apple. Let us turn now from the divine chaos of golden apples and goddesses to the woman who would, according to some, launch 1,000 ships. That may be a bit of an exaggeration. Poets have never been known for restraint, but it's fair to say that Helen of Sparta, later of Troy, was at the very heart of the storm. Helen's story begins before she was even born, which is always a worrying sign. Her mother Leda was Queen of Sparta. One afternoon, Zeus, that most persistent of Olympians, spotted her from the heavens and decided, as he often did, to seduce her. But rather than appear as himself, divine, radiant, occasionally wielding thunder, he chose instead to transform into a swan. Because of course he did. The result of this peculiar encounter was, depending on the version, either an egg or several. Yes, Leda laid eggs. Myths, as you'll find, are very particular about the strange and not terribly interested in the plausible. From these eggs hatched Helen, and sometimes also her brothers Castor and Pollux, and her sister Clytemnestra, who will later become very important when things begin to unravel back in Greece. But for now, Helen was raised in royal luxury. She was, from the beginning, a marvel. Not just beautiful. Her beauty, we're told, was divinely beautiful. The kind that made men sigh, women whisper, and kings behave very badly. Now, as Helen came of age, she was pursued by just about every eligible man in the Hellenic world. Her suitors included the finest warriors, princes, and kings, including Odysseus, Ajax, and Menelaus. There were so many that her mortal father Tyndareus rightly feared that whoever he chose, the others would almost certainly take offence, start a war, and probably ruin the hedgerows on the way out. So, on the advice of Odysseus, ever the strategist, Tyndareus made the suitors swear a binding oath, the oath of Tyndareus. They would all agree to honour Helen's choice, and, more importantly, to protect the chosen husband should anyone ever try to take her from him. A clever solution, and one destined, as clever solutions often are in Greek myth, to backfire spectacularly. Helen chose Menelaus, brother of Agamemnon and future king of Sparta. Now, Menelaus was competent, wealthy, respected, not particularly charming but not easily ignored. The kind of man who polishes his own armour and expects you to notice. Helen and Menelaus were married, and for a time all was well. They had a daughter, Hermione, settled in the Spartan palace, and reigned peacefully over a well-ordered kingdom. And then Paris arrived. Paris, son of Priam and Hecuba of Troy, had been raised not as a prince, but as a humble shepherd, a common trick in myth when someone's birth is accompanied by a troubling prophecy. In Paris's case, the prophecy was specific and rather ominous. He would cause the downfall of Troy. So naturally, his parents did what any responsible monarchs would do. They abandoned him in the wilderness. Unfortunately, Paris survived. Raised among shepherds, he grew into a man of striking beauty and very little foresight. He was eventually welcomed back into the royal family, prophecy presumably forgotten in the excitement. Not long after, he was sent on a diplomatic mission to Greece, officially to establish friendly relations, unofficially to stir up the plot. When Paris arrived in Sparta, Menelaus welcomed him warmly, a gracious host by Greek standards, which usually meant offering food, wine, and not stabbing anyone. But then Menelaus was called away to attend a funeral. Paris, ever the opportunist and heavily influenced by Aphrodite, who had promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, took advantage of the king's absence. Whether Helen was a willing accomplice or a victim of divine manipulation is one of the great ambiguities of ancient myth. Homer's Iliad presents her as conflicted, ashamed, reflective, but not clearly coerced. Later tragedians such as Euripides give her more agency or none at all, depending on the tone. Some versions, like the Helen of Euripides, go so far as to say she never went to Troy, that Paris stole only a phantom image while the real Helen remained in Egypt, as confused as anyone. But the popular version holds that Helen went with Paris, sailing across the Aegean to Troy and leaving behind her husband, her child, and more importantly, the oath that bound all her former suitors. When Menelaus returned to find his wife gone and his honour publicly shredded, he did not mourn in silence. He invoked the oath. Across Greece, messengers were sent. Kings were summoned. Old alliances reawakened. Even those who had long since moved on were now bound by a sacred promise. And what a collection of heroes it was. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, assumed command. He was ambitious, proud, and not above sacrificing his daughter when the wind refused to blow. But that's a tale we touched on earlier. Odysseus tried to stay out of it. He had a young son, a clever wife, and no interest in foreign entanglements. So he pretended to be mad, ploughing his fields with salt. But when Greek agents placed his infant son Telemachus in front of the plough, Odysseus swerved, proving his sanity and sealing his fate. Achilles, the greatest warrior of the age, was also reluctant. His mother Thetis had hidden him away on the island of Skyros, disguised as a girl among the daughters of King Lycomedes. Why? Because it was foretold that if Achilles went to war, he would not return. But again, Odysseus came up with a solution. He laid out gifts for the girls: combs, bracelets, mirrors, and one sword. Achilles chose the weapon. Predictable, but effective. In time, a vast army gathered. Ships were prepared. Legend says 1,000 ships. And the greatest force the Greek world had ever known assembled under Agamemnon's banner. Before they sailed, however, they needed a good omen. You see, the Greeks took signs very seriously. The gods didn't send text messages, but they did send birds. At Aulis, a serpent appeared and devoured 9 sparrows before turning to stone. The seer Calchas declared this meant the war would last 9 years, and Troy would fall in the 10th. One imagines morale dipped slightly. Even so, the Greeks launched their expedition. But they didn't find Troy immediately. First, they accidentally attacked Teuphronia, a city that rather unfortunately looked quite a bit like Troy. Geography, it turns out, was not the Greeks' strong suit. Eventually, they reached Troy and established a camp along the shores outside the city's mighty walls. These walls, according to myth, had been built by Apollo and Poseidon in disguise, when they were briefly punished to serve King Laomedon. So they were, to put it mildly, sturdy. This would not be a quick war. Inside Troy, Helen was received, not as a prisoner, but as a queen. Priam, the aged king, treated her kindly. His son Hector, the city's greatest warrior, was polite, if somewhat disapproving. The city, for all its splendour, had become a cage. Helen was now the face of a conflict she had little control over, worshipped and blamed in equal measure. The war, meanwhile, settled into a long and grinding stalemate. Raids, skirmishes, and embassies followed. Heroes rose and fell, and through it all, Helen remained at the centre, not fighting, but watching. Her story is one of paradox. She is both victim and agent, loved and hated, remembered not for her deeds but for her presence, her role as the prize over which the greatest warriors bled and perished. And what of Helen herself? Well, the myths offer no simple answers. Some say she came to love Paris, then hated him. Some say she pitied Menelaus, then despised him. In one version, when Troy falls, she returns to Sparta with her husband, who forgives her. In another, she is strangled by Menelaus' mother in a fit of righteous fury. The poets could never quite decide what to do with her. She was too beautiful to be evil, too dangerous to be good. She was, perhaps, the embodiment of the war itself, not rational, not fair, but entirely inevitable. And thus, with Helen in Troy, Menelaus in fury, and every king in Greece committed to vengeance, the stage was fully set. The war had not yet begun in earnest, but the fuse had been lit. The walls of Troy still stood tall, but every god, every mortal, and every poet knew they would not stand forever. In our next chapter, we'll meet the full cast of heroes and begin the siege proper, a war of pride, prophecy, and tragedy that would shape not only myth, but the entire identity of the ancient Greek world. For now, rest, dear listener. The storm is gathering, but there is still time before the swords begin to sing. It is a strange thing, preparing for a war that has not yet begun. The swords have not been drawn, the ships not yet launched, but the decisions made in these moments, the quiet ones, the stubborn ones, echo as loudly as the battle cries to come. And so, we find ourselves back in Greece, where alliances are being called upon, oaths remembered with theatrical seriousness, and kings emerging from the shadows of their own ambitions. The Greeks, or more properly, the Achaeans, were not one nation, but a loose collection of fiercely independent city-states, each with its own king, customs, dialects, and irritating sense of superiority. Herding them was rather like herding cats. Large, armoured, arrogant cats. And yet, somehow Agamemnon was the one to try. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, was not the most beloved of men. He had the charisma of wet marble and the diplomatic subtlety of a battering ram, but he had ships. And in Bronze Age Greece, that made all the difference. He was also the brother of Menelaus, whose wife Helen had just absconded with a Trojan prince, or been abducted, depending on whom you asked. Either way, it was Agamemnon's duty to help. And, not incidentally, to increase his own power while doing so. But before we set sail, let us first meet the key players of this great war. Some of the finest names ever shouted across a battlefield or penned into epic verse. There was Odysseus, king of Ithaca. Cunning, sardonic, and too clever by half, he would rather be farming than fighting. When the summons came, Odysseus attempted to dodge the draft by pretending to be mad. He yoked a donkey and an ox together and began ploughing his fields with salt. Unfortunately for him, the Greeks had brought a man named Palamedes, who was even cleverer. Palamedes placed baby Telemachus, Odysseus's infant son, in front of the plough. Odysseus swerved. Sanity revealed. Off to war he went, fuming all the while. Then there was Achilles, the son of Peleus, a mortal king, and Thetis, a sea nymph with a gift for dramatic exits. Achilles had been raised by the wise centaur Chiron, who taught him medicine, music, hunting, and more importantly, how to kill things gracefully. Now, Thetis had received a prophecy. Her son would either live a long, quiet life and be forgotten, or die young in glory and be remembered forever. She, understandably, preferred the first option. So she hid Achilles on the island of Skyros, disguised as a girl. It's unclear how convincingly he played the part, but he lived among the daughters of King Lycomedes, perhaps hoping that history would simply forget him. History, of course, never forgets Achilles. Odysseus was sent to fetch him. Knowing that no warrior could resist the call of glory or the clink of bronze, he laid out gifts before the girls, fine robes, trinkets, and one gleaming sword. Achilles, predictably, reached for the sword. A trumpet was sounded, and the ruse collapsed. Achilles, now revealed, was promised honour, plunder, and everlasting fame. He accepted. He also brought with him his lifelong companion Patroclus, who had become as vital to the war as any sword or shield. Others joined too. Ajax the Greater, son of Telamon, a towering brute of a man, strong as a bull and roughly as eloquent. Diomedes, a young king of Argos, known for his ferocity and surprising reverence for the gods. Nestor, the aged king of Pylos, who spoke mostly in long-winded stories about how things had been better in his day, and who somehow made everyone listen. And Calchas, the seer, who claimed to read the will of the gods by studying the flight of birds, the livers of sacrificed animals, and, one suspects, the fine art of educated guessing. All together, they gathered their men, their ships, and their supplies at the port of Aulis, a wind-swept harbour on the eastern coast of Boeotia. It was here, legend tells us, that the Greek fleet assembled. 1,000 ships, if Homer is to be believed. It is a lovely round number, and deeply impractical. But myth was never built on practicality. And then, nothing happened. The ships were ready. The men were restless. The gods, however, were silent. No wind stirred the sails. The sea lay as flat as a philosopher's expression. A calm so total it felt like divine punishment. And indeed, that's exactly what it was. You see, Agamemnon had made a mistake. While out hunting, he had killed a sacred stag, an animal beloved by Artemis, goddess of the hunt, protector of maidens, and not one to take a slight quietly. As if that weren't enough, he had allegedly boasted that he was the better hunter, which, one imagines, was the mythological equivalent of poking a sleeping bear with a borrowed spear. So Artemis refused to let the winds blow. The ships would remain trapped at Aulis unless Agamemnon made amends. And by amends, she meant sacrificing his daughter, Iphigenia. This, needless to say, did not go over well. Agamemnon hesitated. He wept. He argued. He appealed to the gods. But in the end he agreed. For the sake of the war, for the sake of honour, vengeance, and all the usual platitudes, he sent word to his wife, Clytemnestra, that their daughter was to be married to Achilles. A lie, of course, a fatal one. Iphigenia arrived, excited, perhaps even blushing, and was led to the altar. Some stories say she was killed. Others say Artemis, in a rare act of mercy, whisked her away at the last moment and replaced her with a deer. Either way, the deed was done. The winds returned, the sails billowed, and the Greek fleet at last set out across the Aegean Sea. But their first stop was not Troy. In one of those inconvenient footnotes that history tends to skip over, they accidentally landed in Teuthrania, a city in Mysia. Believing it to be Troy, again, ancient navigation was more art than science. They attacked. The ruler there, Telephus, was wounded by Achilles and fled. Later, in a neat twist of irony, he was healed by Achilles, using the very spear that had pierced him. The Greeks, it seems, could be both destructive and useful, sometimes in the same breath. Eventually, the fleet reached the shores of Troy, a city on the western coast of what is now Turkey. The Trojans watched from their walls as the horizon filled with black sails, and they prepared. Let us pause here to consider what sort of city Troy might have been. The archaeological site known today as Hizarlik in northwestern Turkey reveals layer upon layer of cities built and destroyed over centuries. One of these layers, Troy 6 or 7, shows signs of fire, war, and abrupt ruin. There are fortification walls, storage jars, and signs of trade with the Mycenaean world. Whether it was the Troy of Homer, we'll never know for certain, but the echoes are there. The Trojans too had their heroes. Priam, the old king, wise and weary, ruled from the citadel. His wife Hecuba kept a close court. Their sons were many, but most famous was Hector, the defender of Troy.